right. Welcome, everyone. The day we've been waiting for. Good to see you. I was looking through I did a quick search on Google for Hans Riemer and kittens, because I remember that I mentioned when this was first introduced about 3.5 years ago that at the time there was a craze on the internet to look at photos and videos of kittens, and that if I searched that, I would find when it was that we first took this up, because it's been so long I actually couldn't remember. It's been 3.5 years. 3.5 years that we have been discussing at the county council what rules would we establish to allow the expansion of wireless networks in the county. And we've been kind of up and down and all over, and the bottom line is we still haven't made any real progress. And in 3.5 years, other jurisdictions have taken action. And while we've been talking and talking, we are now the only jurisdiction in the Washington region of any significance that has yet to establish rules for the expansion of wireless networks. And it's a vexing issue, because I think we're all concerned about economic development and creation of jobs, and infrastructure is a key element of that. And communications infrastructure, like electrical infrastructure and transportation infrastructure and water infrastructure, is just a fundamental. And the county has never been behind on that. We've always had the benefit of fiber optic deployment and really good wireless coverage. But if you look down the road, I think that really is in question. So we're grappling with what to do about that. The purpose of the zoning text that we're reviewing is to set those rules, and I certainly believe that the county has to be at the cutting edge of technology and communications, and that we want to be known as a community where research and innovation and invention is happening. And that requires technology, and communications is how technology works. It's, to me, pretty analogous to electricity. Wireless is how devices work together, and it's how we communicate with our technology. But the challenge is that the infrastructure itself is changing, and so in the future, or now actually in the present, we need to allow antennas, not unlike Wi-Fi routers, on utility poles. And that gives people pause. We all have a Wi-Fi router in our house, maybe more than one. We go to a restaurant, or a cafe, we expect them to have Wi-Fi routers at the cafe. We've got them in this room. We've got them, all of our offices have them in every hallway. We expect to have Wi-Fi everywhere. Well, Wi-Fi is a pretty good analogy for the next generation of wireless. It's like a router coming out of the fiber network, and the router has to be on the telephone pole or on a light pole in order for the network to work. And that's a challenge, because it adds some equipment to telephone poles, requires the installation of equipment on telephone poles or light poles. You may have to replace light poles with taller light poles, or telephone poles with taller telephone poles. Or if you don't have telephone poles, you may have to install some kind of, fixture, and that creates some anxiety and some questions. And so that's what we have to work out. And so the purpose of this zoning change is to, address that issue. I think this is, a terrific symbolic challenge for the county. And I think our predicament today about job growth is, related to this kind of issue. Like, are we able to make the kinds of decisions that other communities have been able to make? Are we able to do that or not? And I think that is a question that we're confronted with time and time again, and this is a good example of it. I know that some people feel like we can just be complacent and we can take these kinds of things for granted and that it'll all work itself out. We just have to not be the worst, we just have to not be the worst in the region. That's all we have to worry about. As long as we're not last, we're first. That's not the way it really works. So, I think we have to tackle it, to take it on. County Executive Leggett certainly believed that. And County Executive Leggett led the charge on allowing this type of infrastructure. And I worked with him to advocate before the FCC to protect the county's authority to pass an ordinance like this. And the whole purpose of our advocacy, and I met with County Executive Leggett and Congressman Raskin, we met with Chairman Pai, and we said to him very assertively, we do not want you to seek to preempt us. We want to make the decisions ourselves. We want to deploy these networks on our terms, but we want to deploy the networks. We are not seeking to block the network. We're seeking to facilitate the network. So you don't need to preempt us because we understand that we need to have these networks. And our goal here is to get it done and get it done the right way. And that was our argument to the FCC. And I think that is our core argument to the world, is that we can do it, we can get it done. And that's why in my view, that's why we're suing. We're suing to preserve our authority to pass this ordinance. My two colleagues, have not been here for those 3.5 years of fun, and so I think today is going to be, substantially, we need to talk about these issues. We need to just have good discussion. We're not voting on anything today. But what I really wanted to focus on is, why we are taking this up, like why, from an infrastructure perspective, the rules need to change, what other jurisdictions are doing, and how this relates to the legal issues that we're confronting, our own challenges. So I thought if we could just talk about those three topics, that would really, that would be a lot, and we could, that would be plenty. So I'm going to start with a little bit about why we need to do this, and then we'll get some comments from the folks who are with us in front, and I'll ask my colleagues to just ask questions. I ask you to ask questions about why we might need this, or why you think we might not need that, if that's your perspective. Let's engage in the substance of what this ZTA actually does. And then we'll take a look at what other jurisdictions have done, and then we'll talk about the lawsuits that we are leading and what the relationship is between the ZTA and the lawsuits. Because I know that's a real concern. I know a lot of people have said, why would we enact a zoning ordinance if we're suing the FCC? So we need to talk about that and kind of just bring that out and let everyone ask questions and state views. So, the ZTA is just one of several pieces to this conversation. The principal issue of the ZTA is how close can an antenna be to a building. That is the principal issue. There are other issues that subsequent or separately have to be addressed, like the fees, the process. But the principal issue here is about how close the antennas have to be or can be allowed to be to a building. So, you know, I'll explain my view of it, and then again, we'll just have discussion here. The existing wireless networks that we use talk to antennas that are on large towers that we see, you know, by the side of the highway, off in the distance, on top of office towers, on top of apartment buildings. That is how our current wireless networks work. The signals travel a long distance. And the challenge is that those networks are running out of capacity, and the next generation of technology has a lot more capacity, but the signal doesn't travel as far. And so antennas have to be closer to us, to our phones, to our devices. But our rules only contemplate large or distant towers. So we have requirements for distance from the nearest structure that prohibit the placement of antennas at distances that you will commonly find in the right-of-way. You know, you can't, you're not allowed to put an antenna on a telephone pole, generally speaking. There are some places, but for the most part, most of the telephone poles are going to be out of reach. You know, only a fraction would be allowed. So the core issue is, could there be wireless coverage? Could there be networks if we didn't change the rules? So I wanted to just engage on that point. We had developed a map. The executive branch developed a map. I'm going to ask staff, my staff, Tommy Hybor, who's been in the trenches on this issue for several years, to pull this up. So, Tommy, why don't you start with just walk us through here.
What you're looking at here on the map is poles.
Is there a way to get it on the screen up front, or are we can use the map as well, but if we could get it on the screen, that'd be nice, but that's all right. We use the...
Hopefully
Okay.
someone will be able to address that while I'm talking. So the map we're looking at here shows what poles are available that are over 300 feet from a structure.
Okay, let's stop there. Why did you say over 300 feet? Jeff, what is the relationship here?
That's the current requirement for the approval of a pole, even through the conditional use process.
So no pole can be closer than 300 feet?
Yes.
Wow.
And it can only be, once you have a site that has a 300-foot setback, possibly, it can be moved closer if that area is less observable by neighbors. So the hearing examiner has a little flexibility, but the first requirement that it have some area on the site that's 300 feet
Okay.
from its property.
So those are the poles in red, are the ones that are where an antenna could be placed. And as you can see, that's basically, it doesn't reach into much of the county. It's concentrated maybe along some major arterials, but it's not, it doesn't cover the county. Okay. What would be next?
All right. So if the ZTA as drafted would allow limited use for poles that are at least 60 feet away from structures. So that's what this looks like.
Okay. So then you have a map where there's a dot for every pole that is limited use for 60 feet. That's what that is? And then maybe you can zoom in a little. I don't know if you can zoom in a little
Yep.
bit. Okay. And now, next.
30 feet.
30 feet. All right, and now you've got a map that shows a dot for every pole where it's 30 feet. So a lot of the 5G technology, travels a short distance, several hundred feet perhaps. I think there's different technologies. There's not like one type of use here that is the same for every provider, or they're a little bit different, but generally speaking, it's a short distance technology. It is more analogous to the Wi-Fi router model from that perspective. You got to be close to a Wi-Fi router in order to get a signal. You got to be fairly close to a 5G transmitter in order to get a signal. So that's the issue. I mean, that's it in a nutshell right there. So I want to just ask my colleagues, do they have questions about that? What would you want to know about that? How does that strike you? Because it's the core issue is, could the companies build a network if we didn't change the rules? And it's my assertion that they can't. I think that's pretty plain from the 60-foot. That you couldn't build a network into outside of 300 feet from, or outside of where the red dots are. Any questions? No questions. Do you agree with my assertion here?
No, but you're on a roll.
Okay, well, then if you don't agree, that's fine. Let's hear what you have to say. I mean, what do you think about this core issue?
No, I mean, it's logical, makes sense. I have questions about other issues, and so I'm waiting to get to those. But
That's fine.
So
I wanted to engage on this issue because I
Sure.
think it is essential.
I mean, but yeah, I mean, the logic makes sense. The technology has to be close together. 300 feet wouldn't allow it. I mean that. I think we can understand your point there. That doesn't mean. I think there's larger questions about the use and when will they deploy and how are we currently, managing our current system where applications are in. There's a whole bunch of other questions, the court cases, other things that I think we want to engage on. But I think the premise is pretty clear. If you wanted to have deployment under the current rules, you couldn't do it. I mean, that's why we're here. That's why you put the thing forward. So I don't. That seems.
I just wanted to know if we accept or agree with that premise. Jeff, did you want to say something?
I did. This is a very complicated subject when it gets to utility poles.
Yeah.
Utility poles are considered an existing structure as opposed to a new pole. On an existing structure, you can have a 60-foot setback.
Right.
Today. Now, you can't go to 30 feet, but you can have an antenna on a utility pole if it has a 60-foot setback.
Right. But you couldn't do a new pole.
You couldn't do a new pole,
But
and
you
you
could.
couldn't put it on a house. You
couldn't
couldn't
put
put
it on a
it
house.
on a house within that zone. It's specifically prohibited, although within the category of antenna on an existing structure, it would allow it on a utility pole.
Do you have questions on the technology issue?
Well, my view is, I think similar to what Will just said. I mean, my concerns are far more about the process than the policy and the substance of it. And so I look forward to hearing more on the legal side of it, because that's really where a lot of my concern lies before we even get into the substance of it. But I will save my questions for that piece. But I don't disagree with what has been said or have an issue necessarily with what has been said, but how does that relate, I guess, to the speed currently of the deployment? I mean, I think that would be the related question to this. So I don't know if we have someone here to answer that, but that would be the
Can you
the related
rephrase
question.
that, or I'm not sure if I understand what
Yeah. So the premise right now is that based on the current rules, you couldn't deploy the technology at 300 feet, although there is some opportunity for 60 feet with existing poles, as we just heard. But the question is, in terms of deployment, is this being deployed now? What is being prevented specifically?
I'm a lawyer, I hate pronouns. The this of that is either 4G or 5G.
Well, we're talking about 5G, right? I mean,
So
Well,
far as I know, 5G
both.
is not being deployed right now. Mitzi Herrera can answer the question better than I can.
assume I have no idea what I'm talking about when it comes to technology, because I have no idea what I'm talking about when it comes to technology.
It's your quick study. Mitsuko Herrera with the Department of Technology Services. So it's unfortunate that we use the term 5G and small cells to talk about many things, and we use the same term, which leads to a lot of the confusion. 5G as a marketing term really means the ability to get a gigabit of service to your phone. So you can do more things on a mobile device. 5G as a general term also is sort of a substitute for saying that we want to have many things connected to the internet. So if you think of 3G was connecting your computer at the home to the internet, 4G was connecting your mobile phone to the internet, 5G can also mean connecting everything. But it doesn't mean...
That's when people say the Internet of Things. That's what they're referring
Correct,
to. Is that
correct. But those things don't necessarily mean that things are connected using the wireless technology that we're talking about today. So you can have Bluetooth, you can have LiDAR, which is using light instead of radio, like radar. A lot of the things that they're talking about, cars talking to each other, they're not talking about the signal from the car going up to a pole and coming back to the car. They're not talking about licensed spectrum that we're talking about here today. So it's unfortunate that we use it for a lot of different things.
Can I just pause it? Because it is a reality that some of this would be 4G, right?
Yeah.
It's not just 5G. Plenty
So-
of these antennas will be providing 4G coverage where we presently have gaps or just need more 4G antennas.
So yes, so the current, most of what you have on your phone is what we would call 4G spectrum. So it sits in the frequencies that it exists, it sits in a particular area. That spectrum is able to travel long distances. So that's why we've had, and historically in the past, why we said that if the county had a reason for wanting to have antennas deployed in areas, commercial areas, industrial areas, further from residential, because there really wasn't much of a need to have them in residential areas. If you think of it currently in the 4G, you would have a tower, let's say that it sits 100 feet tall, and it covers about a circumference, or sorry, a circumference of a radius about a mile, right? Within there, if you used newer technology, small cells, which can use the same spectrum or shorter wavelength spectrum, true 5G, millimeter wave technology. But within that circle of a mile, you could fit 57 small cells. So the issue is that each of those small cells can deliver as much capacity as that single larger area. But they have to be much shorter, something closer to like 35 feet high. And what it's really doing is, in the newer technology, whether it's 4 or 5, what it's really doing is, it's sort of, if you think of that, I'm running from my office down to the water cooler, my office down to the water cooler, my office down to the water cooler. If I shorten the distance between my office and the water cooler, I can go faster and faster. And the idea is that you're just sort of, I hand something off and now I'm open to run again. I hand something off, open to run again. And that's really what these things are looking to do. So the last piece of this is that true millimeter wave technology is higher frequency, and it has greater capacity, but it travels a shorter distance. Verizon owns the most of that specific true 5G spectrum. T-Mobile, Sprint, AT&T own other 4G spectrum. And it is not a fait accompli that everybody's going to rush to the new millimeter wave technology. But within even people who are using 4G, they have a need to fill in their networks, what people sometimes call densification. So just like when I talked about that you might have that 1 mile area of coverage, within it, I might know that I have a large grocery store, or I have a downtown area where I want to have some antennas that are at a lower height so that I can provide more capacity in that area.
Okay, thank you. I wanted to, Councilmember Joanno's question. So densification of 4G, that is more antennas to expand the capacity of our existing networks. The companies have very few places under the current rules that they can place additional antennas, and they need more locations that they can put antennas in order to bring more depth or capacity to existing networks. And that's partly what this is about. This is in the shorter term, or even in the longer term. This is about partly allowing densification of existing networks, regardless of 5G.
So thank you, and you can continue, but I just want to get the question in while it's in my head. So you're raising an issue that was one of my questions about what is the need or the public interest here? You know, I think my job is to say, okay, we all use our phones. We want to make sure that for 1,000 reasons that they work and that calls aren't dropped and that the network is not overburdened, right? You know, and we realize more people are adding devices, you know, day by day. It's common to have 2 devices. Homes are adding, you know, we realize we want to use it for more things. The argument that's been put forth by industry, I want you to comment on that in relation to what you're saying, the need for these shorter wavelengths. I get the water cooler analogy. It's a great analogy. Are we at the point, in your opinion, and you can explain what this means, that the network is overburdened and our residents that we represent are at the point where their cell phones calls are going to start dropping, and if we don't do this, they're not going to be able to, if without the densification of 4G, which I agree with you, that's going to be what happens. That's the primary driver first, and then you'll have some of the true 5G come on over time. Are we at a point in Montgomery County where that's a problem, that capacity issue?
Oh, I would say that the information that we asked for about the capacity and the overburdening of that capacity, that's a couple years old. So I haven't asked in 2020 for a refresh of that, and that's one thing that we can do.
And you're asking the providers?
You ask the providers mostly in their networks. We have other survey tools that we're hoping to, that we've launched, but we'd like to publicize more so that people can actually take speed tests using their devices, whether they're connecting on.
We're getting direct to consumer, so we're getting
Correct.
information from consumers.
So right now, if you go to Speed Check Montgomery, checkspeedmontgomery.com, you can go in and you can select whether you're connecting from your home network or your business, public Wi-Fi, or your mobile. And you can run a speed test, which helps us create geolocation about where people are having higher speeds, where they're reporting lower speeds. It also gives you the ability to add in comments. So if people have things like, yeah, it works in my driveway, but it doesn't work in my house, you know, those types of things, you can go and do that. And so that's one of the things, sort of crowdsourcing to get that data to supplement other things. We have information, most of the information you're going to have about how a network runs is going to come from the carrier. In that area, there were pockets of the county, particularly places in the dense commercial areas, Silver Spring in particular, where they were running out of capacity. So the service area is within there, but when you add in sort of predicted patterns, some of this can be based on what your network usage is, some of it can be looking at things like, where do you find people posting a lot of things on social media where they tag those to kind of look to see where are your high demand areas. In those areas, they are running out of capacity. And what it's mostly driven by, it's really not the voice, it's the video. Mm-hmm. It is, and also when you look at, I started to notice this, when you look at a lot of streaming services, and for some reason, you can watch it on your phone, but you can't watch it on the television. Most people,
Unless you have like an Xbox or you have something
right.
like that.
If you're in the house and you connect to a Wi-Fi network, it has nothing to do with what we're talking about today. If you have a fiber connection that's going in. Now, some of the carriers would like to create an alternative to that wired network.
It's cheaper for them if they could move it to wireless and not do underground and fiber.
Well, let me be
Right.
clear. All wireless is still wired. Somewhere in that network, there's a piece of fiber that carries information back.
There's always an antenna coming out of a wire, of a
Right.
fiber network. Even our cell phones today, we're talking to antennas that go down and then they have a fiber.
But if it didn't, but if you did less wiring, that could be less expensive, correct, or no? Is that a wrong premise?
Actually, no, because we've looked at the cost modeling. So one example would be, if I went into a neighborhood and I put a fiber so I have a fiber that goes on the pole, and then I put a connection into the house, versus I put an antenna on that pole and I had a wireless connection to the house. The cost of doing the two are about the same.
The same, okay.
It really is that I could sell other things if I had the wireless connection.
Right.
I could sell other
Got it.
services. So in terms of a business
So you
proposition,
can maximize profit on that.
Right.
So let me just pause you. So you brought up the point about in the dense areas. Let's take Silver Spring. And I saw one of the industry folks brought in a map and said, here are these areas. And they were all dense commercial CR zones.
Yes,
And I said, well, you already have authority to deploy in CR zones.
right.
So could you explain why that doesn't solve, and I understand we need to update the numbers and I think we should do that and do more surveys with consumers. So you could explain what was done by the previous council and the current ability in the CR zones and why that could or could not or is not or should be alleviating that issue.
So I think that's the executive's point, is that there is more work that we can do to get more out of the legislation that we have currently enacted. The biggest thing is that there are two factors. One is that we have drafted, but we have not yet finalized a license agreement to use the street lights that we own. So right
The
now,
commercial zones.
yes, but anywhere.
Anywhere. Okay.
We have those kinds of licenses where people have used buildings that we own. We've got models from other jurisdictions. So if a carrier today wanted to go into a commercial area, they could place it on the building, which the county has had since the early 2000. It's been there a while. That did not change recently. The carrier could put it on an existing utility pole. But if you want to take an existing street light and take it out of the ground, put another one in that's stronger and taller so that it can support an antenna, you would need a license to use our pole, which that we are in the process of drafting. The other thing is that you need a franchise agreement to be able to deploy in the right-of-way within the county. And several of the carriers do not have a franchise agreement. They have approached us about it. They have disagreements about some of the terms that we're requesting, and they have not pursued that. So without those two things, it's hard to make greater use of the street poles, street lights in those areas, but you can make use of utility poles and buildings. The one issue on the buildings is that, again, some antennas need to be higher and some antennas need to be lower. So while it's nice that we built now a 10-story building, putting the antenna on top of it isn't sufficient. In many of those cases, they're going to need to have an antenna that's closer at the 35-foot level or so.
All right.
Okay.
Great question. What is the public interest here? I think that's the core thing that we have to grapple with, right? To me, this is a different type of infrastructure model. And that model was set by the federal government. We have no say in that model. But it is one where private companies build infrastructure, providing services that we all use. And I think we certainly have the public interest of ensuring that our residents have access to advanced wireless networks. I think that is our I think that's our role, is to ensure that our residents have access to those services. The question of whether today, if the world ended right now, are the wireless networks sufficient based on existing rules? Maybe. I think there are problem areas, but generally, the question is not today. The question is, where will we be 2 years from now? Where will we be 4 years from now? Where will we be 5 years from now? And the pace of change is the issue. And the thing about this kind of technology is that new apps are constantly invented that use more and more and more data. We can all think about how big a photo is that we use on our phone. Like years ago, it was like 75 kilobytes. Now the typical portrait that we take is like 10 megabytes. We all have thousands of megabytes on our phones alone. Like that exponential path is our problem. And the network carriers are saying, we're running out of room. We're out of room. They actually say we're out of room. We don't have enough capacity now in places like Gaithersburg, in areas where there are pockets already in residential neighborhoods where they don't have enough antennas. And they would like to put in more now. But again, the question is for local government is, you got to look down the road. You got to be thinking about the future. And the reason why we have adequate coverage today is not because we made a decision today. It's because we made a decision 20 years ago. So that's the issue. If 20 years ago we said we'll wait until we exceed our capacity to make a decision about whether to expand the network, then we would constantly be behind, and the companies would say, we're not going to bother to build there because you won't allow us a path to grow the network.
Well, the county executive is committed and supported to ensuring that Montgomery County residents have access to the most robust wireless, cutting-edge, bleeding-edge wireless services that are out there. But he is asking for a pause in this legislation because what we would like to do is give a chance for our administrative regulations, licensing, other pieces to catch up.
Wait, thank you. You've done your duty. I really, I want the council members to get a chance to ask their questions, and we don't have to yet. There will be a time when, that's what we want to talk about, but.
So to your point, I agree with the premise that we should enable our community to be on the cutting edge with technology and infrastructure. I consider wireless technology and infrastructure. I agree with all those premises. But the reason I was going to the capacity question was because of some of the things that I think we're going to talk about later. Okay, so I don't think anyone up here, I'll speak for myself, is proposing that we wait for 10 years to deploy new wireless technology. I think to the extent that there might be reasonable disagreement about whether a couple month pause or a year pause are required so that this can catch up and that the court cases can go through. I think that's a reasonable discussion. I personally am not of the opinion of this should never happen, and it's going to happen. And the question is, how does it happen, at what pace, with what information, with what tools, how are we currently regulating what we're currently doing? I have serious concerns from what I've been talking to residents about current applications and the current processes we have, and is all that ready to go? And I see that as a short window of time, months to, a year, to let all that happen so that we can get this right. So I think that's why it is connected.
Listen, one step at a time. So, if I think it's important to say whether you believe we should actually have these networks deployed. Like that's a premise. I don't think it's just a premise. I certainly do. I believe very passionately in it.
I just wanted to add in there, because you mentioned it about ensuring that residents have service. One of the things that we have not tackled is a requirement that in areas where we do not have service, that someone has a requirement to build it.
Right. No, and that's a huge issue. I mean, it's the public utility issue, right? You know, and I think that's a fair.
And we don't have the power to do that.
Let me say that while we have functionally, it is very difficult to live in the modern world if you do not have access to the internet. Internet is not regulated as a utility. There is not, unlike electricity, which there is a requirement to serve every address, there is not that requirement with internet services, nor is there a requirement that where there's a gap, coverage gap on wireless services, that there's an obligation to build it. There are other jurisdictions that have tried to come at it in creative approaches, and we're not there yet.
And just so for the residents watching, creative approaches to try to get around that, what is it ultimately a federal decision, if ever, that internet should be provided to everybody as a right, but you're saying there are jurisdictions. Could you give an example of what jurisdictions have done to creatively to ensure that all their residents? Obviously, there's programs that the industry has done that, and I think we've seen progress over the years to try to expand broadband, and particularly to rural and low-income communities. But could you just mention one briefly?
Well, the one that people always like to cite is San Jose, California. I would put a couple caveats on there. San Jose is the crown jewel of Silicon Valley. So this is the real estate that the providers most wanted. It doesn't have a rural area. It doesn't even have even suburban, it's a very concentrated area. So in San Jose, what they made was a deal in which said that you could use access to our poles, but in the same time, there was money that was required to put into infrastructure to build underserved areas. In addition, they had much more significant areas where there was not service available, unlike in Montgomery County. The places that we have where they don't have service available, they tend to be either within the agricultural reserve. They're places where there is either a low concentration, low density of businesses and residents, or they're a little pocket. So we put in a subdivision, and it happens to sit in the little valley, which made it a nice place to build a house, but it made it an expensive place to get a signal to.
Got it.
What do you think, Councilmember Friedson? I feel like Clint Eastwood up here. Again, I think we have been working on this now for 3.5 years, and the question of whether there will one jurisdiction that has done a terrific job building internet service for the public is Montgomery County. Not a lot of communities have built all the way to the home fiber networks. Very rare, very expensive. We could do it, but it would have to be like an absolutely overriding fiscal priority, because you have to risk like hundreds of millions of dollars in expenses to actually trench and build. We could do that, but it would be so risky, because when you build a public fiber optic network like that, will people even subscribe? Will the big telecoms come in and underbid the county on the cost of service, and then you're left with no subscribers, and you spend hundreds of millions, billions of dollars to build a network, have no subscribers, and you've just lost all of that money. Like, that's a big gamble for a jurisdiction to take. Now, if you had no private companies that provided networks in your community, that's not as much of a gamble anymore. At that point, there's no other alternative. So, you ought to do that. In our case, we have private fiber optic networks to the home, I think everywhere except for the Ag Reserve, fundamentally. Like, I think any home in Montgomery County has or can get fiber optic connection, but not the Ag Reserve. And that's a different problem. It's a big problem. But this is wireless, and that's different. And like, no community has public wireless, like, the kind of wireless service that you get on you use on your phone. There is no example of that. And, I don't think that that's possible, frankly. We're just talking about, is it physically possible? Yes. Would it make any sense for local governments or any government to get in the business of, Cuba, not even Cuba does it. Cuba actually has a private telecom that operates their network for them. And they're finally opening up. So, we're left with a public-private, a privately provided service that the public relies upon. And that's the vexing status of this area. And so, we're left to work within that. And, it leaves us in an uncomfortable position of, people don't like their telecom companies all that much. They love what their telecom companies do for them, but they don't like the companies that much. And here we are having to, facilitate deployment of networks. And it just becomes a little awkward. Councilmember Friedson, just wanted to, I guess we can wrap up this conversation about the premise of, do you believe that the rules need to change, that we need densification, whether it's 4G, 5G? Is this something that, would you like to make any comments about that issue, generally speaking?
No, this was really helpful for me to understand a little bit more about the technology and what this will do, what it won't do, what it might do in the future. As I mentioned before, I think the basis of my thoughts on this are mostly focused on the process side of it and the question of where things stand with lawsuits and legislating in the face of litigation when we're party to the lawsuit. So
all right.
I look forward to that conversation.
Fine. All right, so I think this can be relatively brief, but I would like to just highlight what other communities in the region have done. So on page 10, Jeff has provided some of that information. So Fairfax County, you can't get 10 feet, you can't get closer than 10 feet to a right-of-way line. So you can install an antenna anywhere you want in the right-of-way, but you just can't get closer than 10 feet to the right-of-way line.
Which is a very unusual way to put a setback.
It's very supportive of deployment. You look at the entire road, and as long as that telephone pole or light pole is not closer than 10 feet to the right-of-way line, you can use it.
It's true.
And that is why telecom companies are saying they're moving their investments out of Maryland into Northern Virginia, because they got to go where they can have the direct path to construction. Northern Virginia has a very supportive policy. It says we want this to happen.
I think that, though, it's worth pointing out that Virginia is one of 5 Dillon Rule states where local governments have significantly less powers. Fairfax County does not own any of its right-of-ways. Those are all owned by the state, whereas in Montgomery County, we own about half
I actually
ours.
don't think that. I think it's highly relevant as to why Virginia was able to pass the law, but it's not specifically relevant. The point is, what do they allow there? And whether it's because the decision was made at the state level or the decision was made at the local level, the decision is, if you're a company, you can put the antenna on a telephone pole as long as that telephone pole is not closer than 10 feet to the right-of-way line. So,
Certainly much more permissive than Montgomery County.
Montgomery County, you can't be 300 feet to a house. D.C. is, you can put it wherever you want as long as it's not closer than 10 feet to a building, basically.
That's correct.
Which is actually analogous to our urban district code.
That's correct.
That's basically the rule that we put just for the urban districts, but D.C. allows that everywhere. Prince George's County, the Maryland job leader, has now.
I object.
Do you?
He did say Prince George's County, so he didn't say the dreaded PG.
30 feet from a house. That's their new rule. They established that this fall. Arlington County, no setback requirement. You can just put it, as long as there's a telephone pole, you can use it. Now, they have franchise agreements, so they get to issues, I'm sure, about details. But the point is, where can you apply to put an antenna? As long as it's in the right of way. Frankly, I think that makes sense. Yeah, that's really what we ought to do. If it's in the right of way, if it's an existing telephone pole, that's fine. But let's talk about combining and let's not overuse. Let's not have 3 antennas on a block when we could have 1 telephone pole used. Those are important public issues. But, I admire the Arlington County, approach, which is, hey, if there's an existing utility pole, a street light, go for it. So that's the region. To me, this is problematic. Like, I think 3.5 years ago, this was not the case. 3.5 years ago, I think Virginia had probably resolved its rules very recently. I think at that point, I think Virginia did theirs like maybe 5 years ago, something like that.
I'm not sure.
Mitzi, do you remember when? Yeah.
They had state legislation in 18 and 19, so I'm not sure that they had done anything at the local level before then.
All right. So this is when we began this process, there was less disparity. Now we are the only major jurisdiction that has not yet resolved this. So any questions about that? All right. So let's talk about the legal case, because I think that's just a crucial issue.
If you want,
What's that?
if you want me to go ahead, or do you?
I do. I know my colleagues have lots of questions there, so we'll just, so I'm just going to start with my assertion here. The reason why we are suing is so that we can pass this ZTA. If we want to use our local authority to facilitate deployment according to the kinds of terms that are outlined in this ZTA. Whether we lose or win the case, this ZTA is what we want. That's as the author of the ZTA, that's what I have sought to bring to my colleagues, is this is what we want to do, win or lose. This is not a hedge that says, I'm only doing it this way because of the FCC's rule. It is not that at all. This is what I think the best regime is for the county. And frankly, I think if we don't win the case, we may get something that maybe is, more like the Virginia model. I don't know. But the reason we are fighting to protect our local authority is not to block the deployment of networks, although there are many people who wish that that was why we were doing this. The reason we are doing this is to facilitate deployment according to the rules that we believe are the best rules. So what you have in front of you, my colleagues, is what I believe are the best rules. I welcome, that's a collective decision-making process in the end. But let's go to my colleagues for their questions on the legal issues.
I'll yield to the lawyer.
Yeah, thank you. Hey, I appreciate that. Dust off my law degree here. So just as a baseline setting question, and Councilman Friedson and I can share time and go back and forth, could you state, as I often say, and this might be true for this issue, for the millions watching at home.
Hopefully not on their mobile phones, though. That would be terrible.
What the cases are that we're party to and what is being asserted. I just think some people are unclear. I understand Councilman Reamer's characterization of those cases, but I don't think it's quite captures everything. So I don't know who is best positioned to do that, but if you could state what the suits that we're party to and why.
Let me try. The two suits are combined in the Ninth Circuit. The two suits are combined in the Ninth Circuit. There'll be a hearing on the issues on February 10th. We have two separate issues going before the court. The first is on the health issues that that we don't think the FCC has lived up to its obligations on reviewing health concerns. And it really is the FCC responsibility that we're arguing that they have not lived up to.
They haven't updated their study on health effects since 1998 or whatever the date.
That's correct.
Okay.
And we think they're on an obligation to do that. Now, they can do that with either outcome of they look at that and they stick with their current standards, or they can look at that and say that we'll increase the required either setback, or they can reduce the powers that they like, but they can resolve that either way. The other joint petition for judicial review is trying to amend the FCC order that dealt with a lot of things. One was the definition of effectively prohibit, which is this service, which is a term in the congressional bill. The FCC has adopted something to say that it means materially inhibit, which is a much looser standard where it's more likely that you're found to effectively prohibit. The most substantial thing from my point of view is that the FCC has essentially taken our rights in the right of way in terms of our ability to charge fees. We think we have a proprietary interest in that right of way. The FCC does not, and they both want to control the fees we charge for pole attachments and or what I would consider rent, which is our right to charge. We, in this county, we charge a percentage of cable fees for the use of the right-of-way. We charge 5%. As people go to more wireless and off that charge, we will get less from that. So we are thinking of ways of how to amend our franchise fees, but in any event, we would not be able to charge anything for that looks like rent by the FCC order.
So just stop you there. The two lawsuits combined in the Ninth Circuit that have oral arguments on February 10th. First relates to saying the FCC has not done its job in updating its study on the potential health effects of this type of wireless deployment, right, characterizing. The second is related to the definition of effectively prohibit, so that would be local laws that would get in the way of wireless technology deploying. Is that fair to say?
Right, and I think fees is one of those ways we inherit.
Right, and then the fee issue, again, to the point you just brought up, the ability for us to charge fees for the use of the public right-of-way. And so we're party to those lawsuits that are going to be having oral arguments in a couple of weeks. And one of the contentions that bothers me, and I think Councilman Friedson has already mentioned this, is that if, depending on how those go, particularly on the second issue, we could have more or less authority potentially here to make our own decisions.
Well, certainly the sponsors think
Can you get closer?
I'm sorry. Certainly the sponsors think that this is the decision you want to make and should make to deploy this area. In my view, you could pass this ZTA whether you win or lose in this petition for judicial review. There are some other authorities that we may end up with from a successful outcome here, but I certainly think the ZTA is within the latitude that we would be left with. There are other things that deal with aesthetics and what you can do and not deal with aesthetics and undergrounding utilities. The shot clock is also under review. That's the time in which you're required to come to a decision. Right now, it's fairly onerous at 90 days for a new poll from the start of a complete application. This ZTA revised the review standards when you're dealing with a conditional use, but certainly the ZTA is, in my opinion, within the authorities that you have today, win or lose.
And
So
I'd like to hear my colleagues, and then I'm done. It troubles me, again, as a lawyer, and we're party to 2 lawsuits, one of which is asking to update health effects. Not saying that I've reviewed a lot of data. That's not why we're making a decision. But the other is about our local control. It seems a little incongruent to me to proceed with something while that's hanging out there, especially when we're a couple weeks away. And from everything I hear, the Ninth Circuit might decide this case by the summer. And the Supreme Court's probably unlikely to take it up. And so I think that's going to be the decision. So I just would like my colleagues' view on that point of why are we moving in light of that. I think we need to talk about that.
No, absolutely. Well, we'll pass it to Councilman Friedson in a moment, but I wanted to ask Jeff, if we win, the companies will appeal. If we lose, maybe we would appeal. I don't know. What would be the timeline on that?
To have a winning review of cert in the next term, you're at least looking at something submitted the next term, and then you might be waiting as much as a year after that.
And I'm not so sure. I don't think we should speculate as to whether the Supreme Court would take it up or not. I think there's a very strong case to take it up. So maybe they would. I don't know. I mean, how should we think about whether they would? Seems to me we would just as likely assume that they would take it up as not.
Well, usually there's, conflict in the circuits. There's reasons that the Supreme Court takes things up. There will be no conflict here. This is a consolidated one circuit of a Court of Appeals case, which makes it less likely they would take it up. But
there's a very
there's always a
challenging
chance.
issue of federal law here. That's very consequential, which is that Congress has said you shall not block deployment, local governments. That's in the Telecom Act of 1996.
Right.
What that really means in this new environment is very, up in the air.
But I think what would happen is they would send it back to the FCC to make new rules, and then those would need to be promulgated. Then you could challenge again at the Ninth Circuit. So I just don't think
you may be right. That may be exactly right. In which case,
It's longer.
yeah, you're talking about a couple more years.
Right. Well, I mean, yeah, but I'm not suggesting we wait till the end of that legal process. I just think we could have more authority in 3 months or 4 months. I don't think we're in the. That's my question. That's what I'd like your response.
Sure.
If we get some more authority in June,
What would I do with that?
Right.
What would that mean?
Right.
That's an important question. And we'll pass it to Andrew in a moment. But the FCC ruling does not address setbacks. It does not say what the setbacks should be. They leave that to us. So I think we have to decide, what do we think the setbacks should be based on what we want. That's the core issue. And win or lose the case, we still have to make that decision.
If I may, I think as a lawyer every now and then, that is the key decision, because whatever the FCC says, the Congress has said you cannot effectively prohibit. So at some point, you could have setbacks that result in effective prohibition. Now, I don't want to say what those are. I don't want to lead anybody to a challenge based on something that we have. But at some point, you have an effective prohibition.
And and then again, it's to my colleagues, like, what what do we want? What kind of network deployment do we want in this county? And it is primarily driven by the setback rules. And then, of course, and it's not in the CTA, fees, licensing, franchise agreements. Those are subsequent decisions that we will also have to grapple with, unfortunately. But, the primary issue here is, what do you think is the right setback for this new world that we're in? And my proposal is win or lose the case. Like, if we win the case, I think we need this. If we lose the case, we're going to probably have to do this, minimally. Maybe have to be more like Virginia. Either way, we got to make a change. So I hear what you're saying, but that's, the intent here, and it goes back to the argument we made to the FCC. We want to deploy networks. We want to do it the way that we want to do it. And that's what I have, that's the spirit of this ZTA. Andrew.
Thank you for that. I feel like I've got a technology expert and a lawyer here, and I'm, I guess, the third person on the committee. But I'll do my best to follow the bouncing ball, knowing what I don't know. But my view on this is, I don't really feel that passionately about the specifics of the decisions we make on setbacks or other aspects of the ZTA. My view on it is, at a certain point, you pick a strategy of how to approach an issue. It seems like to me, and I'm having trouble grappling with the fact that the county did pick a strategy. The strategy was to file lawsuits and to assert its authority through those lawsuits. Whether I would have done it or not, whether I agree with the lawsuits or not, is really not material to the situation that we're in. That's the decision that we chose, and it's just hard for me to grapple with the idea that on the one hand we have the lawsuits. That's the strategy that we had chosen prior to me being on the council, and now we're taking another approach to that, and that's just something that I'm having trouble from a process standpoint of getting around. Normally, if you want to assert your ability to pass a law, you pass the law and you challenge the other party to sue you. And that's the opposite of what we've done here. We filed a lawsuit and then put a bill in hoping that that's the part
May
of this.
I correct the record there?
Please. You were here when the
County
lawsuit
Executive
was
Ike
filed.
Leggett, the former dean of the Howard Law School, recommended the ZTA first. This ZTA came long before, not this exact version of it, but a different one, came long before we ultimately filed challenges. So it was always the county's first position that we need to change the rules. But then what the FCC ruling did was, seek to take our right of way. And so we're gonna fight that,
Yeah, but that's the part of this that I can understand, and I certainly would not attempt to compete in a battle with Ike Leggett over legal prowess or just about anything else, tennis, you name it. But it's still, I'm still having trouble understanding how, if you want to assert your authority to be able to do something, you don't do it, and then challenge the other side to sue you, saying that you can't.
That's right, but the council wouldn't pass the ZTA.
But those are two different issues. On the one hand, it's, do you have the legal authority to do something, and has the FCC unfairly limited local control over an issue that should be the sovereign authority of local government. And on the other hand, it's, do you have the political will to pass legislation or zoning text amendment? I personally, I see those as two different things. That has nothing to do with my view on this particular issue. I'm having trouble grappling with that, which is, to me, contradictory, and it is an unusual approach to policymaking where you wouldn't assert yourself by doing what you think you have the right to do, which is, I think, the best way to assert your authority to do something is to do it. And then if another party feels like you don't have the authority to do that, they have the regress to go to the courts to challenge you on your authority to do that. And to me, that decision was a policy decision on this issue. It was a substantive decision to make. Again, I'm not saying I even agree with that decision, whether I thought that was the right decision, the right strategy. It doesn't matter. That's the decision that we have. That is the formal official position of county government. And so to me, that's the challenge that I have, having nothing to do with, necessarily, individual aspects of the legislation. I do have one specific question because I have heard some competing things, and I'd like some clarification, Mr. Zients, if you wouldn't mind, on the shot clock specifically. I think there's some thought, or I've heard some conversation that the shot clock has been challenged in court, that there's a decision on that has changed. Your comments today have suggested that that is an ongoing issue and question. Could you just clarify where that specific aspect stands currently?
It is one of those issues that we've challenged against the FCC order that mandated a 60-day shot clock for existing structures, to put in an antenna on an existing structure, 90 days for new structures, and prohibited pre-application meetings. I mean, this is a very complex petition for judicial review. It's a couple hundred pages, and we are challenging that.
And have any decisions, not just on our lawsuits, but any lawsuits in the last 12 months impacted this shot clock question?
I don't recall it, but there is some discussion on what does it mean when you don't need a shot clock. Certainly the industry was arguing that if you don't meet it, it's automatically approved as submitted. And so far as I know, the FCC did not go along with that, and you then have to get a court action to go forward with that delayed application. So it really means that the shot clock is the start of another issue that needs to be resolved. But as it is, it's a tight timeline, particularly when you have a discretionary process. And some jurisdictions have, particularly Virginia, has prohibited local jurisdictions from having a special exception approval in order to meet the shot clock. But I have not researched a case that came forward. If you want me to do that, I will do that.
If there's any update on that, I'd be interested, and I just have heard from individuals that there might be a change to that, and so it would be helpful to have some clarification, but I can follow up with you on that. I guess the overarching question is this, based on this legal question, and this is the area that I just have real trouble grappling with personally on this particular policy issue. If, regardless of the outcome of the two lawsuits, this is the zoning text amendment and the type of standards and setback requirements that we would put in place and implement as the most desirable public policy outcome, then why are we a party to two lawsuits?
Again,
what's the point of the two lawsuits? If this is the policy goal outcome, then, and we can do it with or without the lawsuit, then it would beg the question of what the purpose of the lawsuit is.
There is certainly an issue with fees that we have a very much an interest in deciding, and again, I think it amounts to a taking of our right of way.
Let me be clear. I totally agree with the issue of fees. I think the question is twofold. Either we could have sued just on fees, which we didn't, or we could have passed a zoning text amendment and then passed related bill and regs based on fees and challenged the industry to sue us based on the fact that, you know, the industry thinks that we had not followed the FCC. We think the FCC is out of line with their inhibiting our ability to exert local control over our own public rights of way and our own ability to charge for our own property, which, you know, that's a reasonable policy issue that could be, you know, weighed through the court. I'm not sure that it answers the question.
I mean, there's a simple reason for that. We are on a consolidated petition for judicial review for the FCC order itself. And that combined us with everybody else who had an interest in overturning a lot more in that single order than we may have. And that's an efficient way to pursue judicial action and get a review. So we're in there with everybody else. It will result in some additional authorities in aesthetics that under the order you wouldn't have. That may matter depending upon how you go. But again, I'll say that you can go forward with this ZTA, win or lose that lawsuit.
Would you characterize both lawsuits in the way that you just characterized that?
The health effects one, where is a individual action that we pursued, and that really goes to the, if you will, the public outcry for some consideration of health. Under the congressional action now, the federal law, you being the council, are prohibited from considering anything about health. So therefore, the petition that we have going is as much as you can do to make the FCC do what it can do in health. So therefore, it gives you a reason to say we're doing what we can and we're going forward. That's my explanation.
I appreciate it. I still haven't, you know, kind of gotten to the heart of the question. I mean, my view is if this is the approach to move forward with the zoning text amendment, then being party to the lawsuits is not the right approach. I'm not saying one approach is better than the other. I'm just saying that, to me, both is problematic, and that's what I'm trying to grapple with and wrap my head around. So
I think you got to the heart of the issue, actually. The question is, why are you suing? Are you suing to block deployment, or are you suing to conduct deployment according to your own rules? If you believe that you are suing to block deployment, then you would, of course, want to wait for the outcome of this lawsuit and only enact rules under court order or FCC order. If you are suing to assert local authority, to protect the interests of local government, to push back against the corporations that are seeking to take our right-of-way, then you would want to demonstrate that you are able to do the job and that you can effectively meet the federal mandate. And that is what we are suing to do. That is the goal, and that has been our message personally to the FCC through numerous meetings, legally by joining this lawsuit with dozens of other local jurisdictions, many of which have already updated their local ordinances while they are parties to this suit.
Let me just quickly, I just want to respond to that because I see what you're saying. I totally respect where you're coming from. The challenge that I have is it is an interesting approach to exert a right to do something by suing for your right to do something when no one is challenging that right to do it. The reason why there's no zoning text amendment that has been passed to set these rules isn't because anybody has challenged it. It's because the political will of the previous council wasn't willing to pass it. That's
what you mean. So we could have never pursued a zoning change, and we could have waited for the industry to take us to court. That would have been a path. And frankly, in light of all the hell we've been through, There are days when I say, maybe we would have been better off. Might have gotten a faster response. But, we could have taken that approach. But we chose to consider establishing a regime.
Could I think there were three options.
Is that what you meant?
Well, kind of, but there's three options. One option would have been to pass a zoning text amendment that could pass through the Democratic leadership, little d Democratic, duly elected leadership that was able to pass it to get the votes necessary to be able to come up with rules that make sense. Whether those rules would satisfy the FCC and the industry would be up to them to decide, and if they didn't think that they were satisfactory, they could sue thinking that they were too unnecessarily prohibitive or restrictive or whatever the case may be. Or the other option would be to wait, to, as you said, and not allow it, and perhaps the industry could sue based on it. This standard that we don't like, which is what is it? Materially inhibited. Materially inhibiting their ability to deploy. The third option is to sue to establish and exert your authority. My challenge is we've picked multiple options to accomplish one policy outcome, and that's what I have trouble figuring out. Again, I'm not a technology expert, and I'm not a lawyer, but that is tough for me from a process standpoint to understand.
And a little quick comment before I go. The telecom companies have sought our support to enact a zoning change rather than take us to court. They could have proceeded under the FCC ruling already if they wanted to, and they could have taken us to court, but they didn't actually want to do that according to them. They wanted to be partners to the county, and rather than take us to court, ask our effort to establish a policy. That is what they have said to us. So, that is why they have not yet taken us to court, because they are seeking our decision-making on the issue.
So the risk of...
Did you want to jump
Yeah,
over
if it's
to-
brief, go ahead. I have another.
Okay. So one way, I think, in the three prongs, Councilman Friedson, that you laid out, the last one is a challenge against the FCC's assertion of authority.
Right.
And that might help clarify that we have long been trying to address deployment in the local community, and in your first prong, sort of asserting that authority. We enacted in 1996, 2006, different regulations which address deployment of the first generation of those towers. In 2014, the council enacted a law to address deployment of small cells. The county has long enacted different parts of the statute which allow co-locations and minor modifications. All of those things are areas in which the fact that you act at a local level doesn't prohibit a different administration, frankly, from coming in at the federal level and deciding that whatever you're doing is not enough. And we will assert our authority to preempt what you're doing and to go further. So it's entirely possible. Baltimore is a good example. They've had deployment on poles that they own, and they charge a fee. And the FCC came in and issued a rule that said, we think that, and so just so we characterize why it's hard to break this out into little pieces. The federal statute says that you may not have the effect of prohibiting deployment of facilities. And the FCC, over a series of orders, is more broadly defining what that means. So saying, I can't place it in this place, I have to pay a fee, how long you get to decide. For example, Congress came in and said in a different statute and said, well, if you're just swapping out an antenna and it's not substantially improving the size of it, you have to approve it. And in that case, you can't deny it. And the FCC came in and said, well, we're going to redefine what substantially means. And that's going to mean 10 feet, 10%, 6 feet out, 4 cabinets, all these other pieces of it. So at some point, your avenue, it's very hard. If you've had a federal case that comes out and says, we determine that the FCC has the ability to do this, as it's a whole administrative law, area, that they have authority to do this, then to come and say, as applied in this specific case, that I should have the right to do it, where the court's already ruled that the federal agency had a right to impose something, it makes it very difficult. So at the end of the day, what you end up having to do is you often have to take multiple strategies. But as the county executive has pointed out, we have taken action. We've taken action in commercial areas. We've taken action in the dense areas. We've taken action to allow co-locations. We've taken actions to streamline the shot clock.
Right.
We've taken actions to move forward with that. What the county executive is looking for is a little more time so that we can, on the administrative front and some of these other pieces, allow the process behind the statutes to catch up.
Yeah, I appreciate you laying that out. And I think it's important to note that you did. Look, we've been moving forward over a number of years for the betterment of our citizens to deploy networks so that people have access. I think that's I'm glad you laid that out. And I think that's the right thing to do. I think we need to move forward. The unique point in time we're at now, to your point of multiple strategies, is that you've had an administration and FCC come in and try to say, no, that's not enough, right? And then a number of jurisdictions are saying, hey, hold on. We've been doing this just fine, right? And so that's why we're part of that lawsuit. The other thing that even further complicates it, and we haven't talked a lot about, and I'm understanding the federal law, is the health effects study. And while we're not basing our decision on that, I think it would not be responsible to say that, hey, here we are out here saying, FCC, do your job as a federal regulatory body charged with keeping Americans safe. Update this study that is, a couple decades old, right? And to have that information and the fact that those are both two-tracked and going right now, I think that's a key piece of the puzzle too. We want to, if we're going to make the best choices, we want to retain our authority to charge fees and to have the regulations that we have, but we also want to have the benefit of that new information, and so our residents can feel comfortable. Obviously, it's a very politically tenuous issue. I think the studies I've reviewed, I think we'll find a way to move forward, but it needs to be done. And then you add on to that the fact that the point that we could come up with additional authorities depending on how this other lawsuit happens. So of course we could always come back and, if Hans has the wherewithal to do it, to bring another ZTA to go further, after we would move on this one. But I think why not? With all that happening, it just makes sense. A couple months is not going to do anything, and that's the struggle I have. I think Councilmember Friedson was saying as well, is where we are in this moment in time, which is a unique moment in time for this issue. Go ahead, Jeff.
Just 2 seconds. It's not the FCC. It's not the FCC that has preempted you from considering health. It is the Congress.
Right.
So there's nothing we're doing in court that does anything with a congressional prohibition.
Right.
You need
We're
to
asking
go
them
to
to update their
Congress.
study.
We're asking them to update the study.
Right.
And really, of all the things I'd like not to talk about is health, because if you get into it, the question will become, are you regulating on that basis? And I'd rather not have to answer that question.
We're not. I mean,
Okay.
we sign over the court case, just to your right, it would be FCC update your study, and then Congress consider the results of that and do whatever you're going to do. You update your law or not, we have no authority to mess with that. I get it. I'm just saying, to not take that into, to lay that out for people, I think is being disingenuous because we're a party to the lawsuit. I just think people need to know that.
I grant that it is awkward. I really do. Welcome to the county council. You're no stranger here, but this is we find ourselves in these positions. My view of that is, I think it's a good faith effort to challenge the FCC to continue to have an ongoing research program. We're not asserting, despite what some lawyers who are getting paid might say, we are not asserting a view on health. We are just saying that they should do more research. I think that is responsible. I think that is appropriate. I think the FCC should continue to research. But we are not asserting a view as to what that research might conclude. And, I think that that is fairly settled. And there really isn't a distinction between the Wi-Fi that we have in our house and the 4G antennas and the 5G antennas. It's all the same. But we'll move on from this topic, lest Jeff, seize up and start throwing things at me.
I think, just on the technically, they are different.
Not from a health perspective. My colleagues need to. I think we did a lot today. I think this was a very productive conversation. And we have another. When is the next meeting scheduled, Jeff?
I'm not sure.
February 3rd.
February 3rd.
All right.
Okay.
So we have another one scheduled, and I hope that we will take this up at that time and recommend it, favorably to the council. But we'll continue to work on this. So we're done with this item for now, and we have another item. We'll leave this. Thank you.
Councilmember Juwan, I'll meet you up at committee session. This will be very quick, and I appreciate the chair changing the location of this meeting to accommodate the large crowd of people who are here interested in our signed ZTA, to amend the standards for signs to better reflect the more modern realities of the county that we live in. This is really just a common sense cleanup to our code, but also a way to help support our business community in a modest way, and to help better reflect what is allowed in terms of signage for a county that is far more urban, a sign standard that has really been set in place in a far too restrictive way and really focused on effectively suburban strip malls. Which is just not the reality that we live in. So that's why I introduced the legislation. It's a pretty straightforward, common sense legislation. I appreciate the support and feedback from DPS. It's been really helpful in this process as well, and I look forward to passage of this. I think this is one small piece of a much broader issue that we do need to address and take up, which is the question of signage and what type of signage is appropriate and reasonable in a county that is what our current county is, of a 1.1 million person jurisdiction that is much more urban than what the sign code and regulations currently reflect. But this is really just a very small, very targeted, very specific way to address that, so that we're not overly burdening and inhibiting something to happen that everybody agrees should.
And just a quick note, this allows rooftop signs in red policy areas. There's a map on page 1 that shows you where they are. They're essentially the most urbanized areas in the county. Rooftop signs are also allowed in urban renewal areas. At some point in the code, we have to consider whether urban renewals are a good geography, since there's nobody alive at DHCA who has anything to do with an urban renewal area. But we'll leave that problem for another day. The planning board and planning staff recommended approval. There are conditions on this that it be part of a sign concept plan, and there's a public hearing before the sign review committee. So with those conditions, the planning staff and planning board recommended approval.
Appreciate that.
All right. Without objection, any questions? No. Thank you very much. I think we'll recommend that favorably. And Councilmember Juwando indicated he was in support. Thank you.